Hello, and welcome to our video on section 2.2 to 2.4, adding and subtracting real numbers. The first thing we're going to do is go over some basic rules for signs. As you may have learned in the past, with addition, when we are adding the same sign, such as a positive and a positive, we add and keep the sign the same. If we have two negatives, we also add the two numbers at their absolute values, that is, and we keep the sign the same. So when we're adding two negatives, we'll get a sum that is negative. Now, the others are when we have different signs. So if we're adding a positive number and a negative number, but the positive has a bigger absolute value, then we will take the difference of the numbers but keep the sign of the bigger absolute value so that our answer will be positive. In the other scenario, we might be adding a positive and a negative number where the negative number has a larger absolute value. Again, we'll take the difference between the numbers, but then our answer will be a negative since it has the bigger absolute value. So let's dive a little deeper into addition and look at some examples that will help us understand these rules. So for the rules for addition, I did put the rules as they relate to absolute value, if that helps. So again, if we're adding two positive numbers, then we're going to have the absolute value of the first number plus the absolute value of the second number. So for a simple example, I'm going to just say if we have the numbers 3 and 7 and we're adding them together, then we would add and keep the sign positive. So that's our most basic kind of example. On the other hand, if I have two negative numbers that I'm adding, notice that the rule says it's the opposite of the addition of the two absolute values. So for example, if I had a negative 3 plus a negative 7, I would still be adding 3 and 7 to get 10, but I would keep the sign negative, knowing that when I add two negatives, the sum is a negative. All right, let's move on to when we have different signs. What if A is positive and B is negative, but A has the greater absolute value? So in that case, we're going to take the difference between A and B and start with, again, the bigger absolute value, which is A, subtract, and keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. So once again, I'm going to use an example to illustrate. If I have 9 plus a negative 3, one is positive and one is negative. What I'm going to do is say, well, the difference between 9 and 3 is 6. But the 9 has a bigger absolute value, so my answer is going to stay positive. Let's contrast that with when we have A is positive and B is negative, but B has the greater absolute value. Then we're going to take the difference again, but this time it would be the absolute value of B minus A, so the positive difference, and we would have our final answer be negative because that's the one with the bigger absolute value. So for example, using 9 and 3 again, what if I said 3 plus a negative 9? Well, again, if I look at the difference between 3 and 9, it's 6. But because the 9 is negative, we know that our answer should be a negative 6 because our negative is a bigger value or absolute value than the positive. All right, now what about opposites? What if we're adding two opposites? Then we know their sum would be equal to 0. So for example, if I'm adding 5 plus a negative 5, then my sum is 0, and we covered that earlier in the year. All right, we're going to go through a couple of examples for addition, and then we'll talk about subtraction. So, two different ways to approach an example like this. we can add and subtract from left to right using our sign rules, which is the first way that I'm going to do it. So negative 16 plus a negative 9, I add and keep the sign the same to get negative 25. And now going from left to right, negative 25 plus 8, I have opposite signs, so I take the difference, which is 17, but I keep the sign of the bigger absolute value, which is negative. And then I add 25, so again I have a negative and a positive. I take the difference between 17 and 25, which is 8, and I keep the sign of the bigger absolute value, which in this case is going to be positive. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to group your negatives together. So again, if I have negative 16 plus a negative 9 and 8 plus 25, I can think of these two numbers have the same sign, negative 16 and negative 9, and these two numbers have the same sign. So if I add negative 16 and negative 25, negative 9, I was thinking of the answer, I get negative 25. If I add 8 and 25, I get 33. Now I can use my rule that says when I have opposite signs, I take the difference and keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. Either way, you're going to end with the same answer. All right, let's move on to another example. Again, I'm going to show this one going from left to right, negative 206 and negative 75. We might need to take out our calculators for that, but that's going to be negative 281. Moving from left to right, I'm now going to say I have opposite signs, so I'm going to take the difference between 281 and 153, which is 128. I'm going to say, oh, but wait, the negative 281 had the bigger absolute value, so I'm going to keep this negative. And now again, I have opposite signs, so I take the difference between 128 and 37 and get 91, but I'm going to keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. If I had grouped my negatives and grouped my positives, then I would have ended up with negative 281 plus 190, same answer, slightly different method. So again, we'll just label those. All right, so then our final example before we move on to subtraction looks complicated because we have a lot of brackets, but we're just going to, again, remember our order of operations, and we're going to look in the first bracket and say, oh, we have a negative 7 plus a negative 1, same sign, add and keep the sign the same. Notice how I changed the bracket to a parentheses because I don't need the differentiation anymore. Here I'm going to say the opposite of negative 7. Remember, we've already learned about opposites. That's going to give me a positive 7. And then I'm going to go ahead and add within the brackets to get a positive 8. And again, I'm going to change that to parentheses. And now I have opposites, which the sum will be 0. Okay, so we're going to move on to subtracting real numbers. And we went over those, again, rules at the beginning for adding, but I'm just going to slide back up quickly and talk about the fact that subtraction means that we're adding the opposite. Okay, so again, this is at the top of your notes. So we can change the subtraction sign to an addition sign and change the sign of the second number. And then we just have to follow the addition rules so we're not learning it, or so that we're not remembering anything new. All right, so let's slide back down to our example. And we have, for all real numbers a and b, the difference a minus b is defined as a plus a negative b. So subtraction, do you see how we took this subtraction sign, changed it to addition, and used the opposite? So a minus b is the same as a plus a negative b. So in our example here, we're going to simplify within the parentheses using our sign rules, 42 minus 50, but we're going to think of that as 42 plus a negative 50. Now, eventually, you won't need to rewrite it this way, but at the beginning, if it's helpful, you can do that. Again, I'm going to need brackets here because I'm going to add some parentheses. And we're going to rewrite 73 minus 60 as 73 plus a negative 60. So in the first bracket, I have a positive and a negative, so I'm going to take the difference, which is 8, but keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. And then I have, in the second bracket, I have a positive and a negative. So again, I'm going to take the difference, which is 13, and keep the sign of the bigger absolute value, which is positive. So now I have a negative 8 minus 13. So remember, that's the same as negative 8 plus a negative 13. I have the same sign. I add and keep the sign the same. So if I add 8 and 13, I get 21. They're both negative, so my sum will be negative 21. So in this next example, we have some big numbers, but we're just going to, again, rewrite as adding the opposite. So now I have 910 plus a negative 939, and then plus a negative 201. So going from left to right, I'm going to take the difference between the positive and between 910 and 939 to get 29, but I'm going to keep the sign of the bigger absolute value, which is negative. And then I'm going to say, okay, I have a negative plus a negative. I have the same sign, add and keep the sign the same. So 29 plus 201 is 230. They're both negative, so my sum will be negative. Okay, so we have one more final example. And in this one, we are, of course, going to follow order of operations. We're going to simplify in that bracket first. So in the highlighted yellow, I have a negative 7 minus a negative 10. Minus negative 10 becomes plus a positive 10. So now in the brackets, which I'm going to change to parentheses since I no longer need the bracket, I'm going to have a 17. So I have negative 15 minus 6 minus 17. Now eventually we're not going to need to rewrite these. We'll be able to just do this without rewriting, but I want you to feel comfortable at the first with doing that. We have 3 negatives. We're going to add them and keep the sign the same. I'm going to go from left to right. Negative 15 plus a negative 6. Well, 15 and 6 is 21. I add and keep the sign the same. And now I'm adding negative 21 plus negative 17. I add 21 and 17 to get, oops, you know what? Let me see. I lost a sign. I just looked at my notes, so maybe you've already picked up on that. But we're going to go back and correct the parentheses because I missed the sign with the negative 7. So negative 7 plus 10 is 3. And then I'm going to erase this, and this is going to be a plus a negative 3, right, when we rewrite that. So my apologies for that. So what we're actually doing here when we go from left to right is negative 21 plus a negative 3, which is negative 24. So I lost that sign, so hopefully that correction makes sense. And you're going to come to class with any questions, and I hope you took good notes. See you in class.